Hello everybody, welcome back. Today I'm going to read you more of the Nutcracker and the Mouse King. So, here we go with the next chapter. This is the story that Drosselmeyer is telling to Marie and Fritz. So here we go. Perlipat's mother was a king's wife. So that, of course, she was a queen. And Perlipat herself was a princess by birth, as soon as ever she was born. The king was quite beside himself with joy over his beautiful little daughter as she lay in her cradle, and he danced round and round upon one leg, crying again and again, "Hurrah, hurrah! Hip, hip, hurrah! Did anybody ever see anything so lovely as my little Perlipat?" And all the ministers of the state, and the generals, the presidents, and the officers of the staff danced about on one leg as the king did, and cried as loud as they could, "No, no, never!" Indeed, there's no denying that a lovelier baby than Princess Perlipat was never born since the world began. Her little face looked as if it were woven of the most delicate white and rose-colored silk. Her eyes were sparkling azure, and her hair all in little curls like threads of gold. Moreover, she had come into the world with 2 rows of little pearly teeth, with which, 2 hours after her birth, she bit the Lord High Chancellor in the fingers, so that, when he was making a careful examination of her features, that he cried, "Oh, Gemini!" quite loud. There are persons who assert that "Oh Lord" was the expression he employed, and opinions are still considerably divided on this point. At all events, she bit him in the fingers, and the realm learned with much gratification that both intelligence and discrimination dwelt within her angelical little frame. All was joy and gladness, as I have said, save that the queen was very anxious and uneasy. Nobody could tell why. One remarkable circumstance was that she had Perlipat's cradle most scrupulously guarded. Not only were there life-guardsmen always at the doors of the nursery, but, over and above the 2 head nurses close to the cradle, there always had to be 6 other nurses all round the room at night. What seemed rather a funny thing, which nobody could understand, was that each of these 6 nurses had always to have a cat in her lap, and to keep on stroking it all night long, so that it might never stop purring. It is impossible that you, my readers, should know the reason of all these precautions, but I do, and shall proceed to tell you at once. Once upon a time, many great kings and many grand princes were assembled at Perlipat's father's court, and very great things were toward. Tournaments, theatricals, and state balls were going on in the grandest scale, and the king, to show that he had no lack of gold or silver, made up his mind to make a good hole in the crown revenues for once, and launch out regardless of expense. Wherefore, having previously ascertained privately from the state head-master cook that the court astronomer had indicated a propitious hour of pork butchering, I think, he resolved to give a grand pudding and sausage banquet. He jumped into a state carriage, and personally invited all the kings and princes to a basin of soup merely, that he might enjoy their astonishment at the magnificence of the entertainment. Then he said to the queen, very graciously, "My darling, you know exactly how I like my puddings and sausages." The queen quite understood what this meant. It meant that she should undertake the important duty of making the puddings and the sausages herself, which was a thing she had done on 1 or 2 previous occasions. So the Chancellor of the Exchequer was ordered to issue out of store the great golden sausage kettle and the silver casseroles. A great fire of sandalwood was kindled. The queen put on her damask kitchen apron, and soon the most delicious aroma of pudding broth rose steaming out of the kettle. The sweet smell penetrated into the very council chamber. The king could not control himself. "Excuse me for a few minutes, my lords and gentlemen," he cried, rushed to the kitchen, embraced the queen, stirred in the kettle a little with his golden scepter, then went back, easier in his mind, to the council chamber. The important juncture had now arrived, when the fat had to be cut up into little tiny square pieces, and browned on silver spits. The ladies in waiting retired, because the queen, from motives of love and duty to her royal consort, thought it proper to perform this important task in solitude. But when the fat began to brown, a delicate little whispering voice made itself audible, saying,
"Give me some of that, sister. I want some of it too. I am a queen as well as yourself. Give me some."
The queen knew well who was speaking. It was Dame Mousey-Rinks, who had been established in the palace for many years. She claimed relationship to the royal family, and she is queen of the realm of Mousolia herself, and lived with a considerable retinue of her own under the kitchen hearth. The queen was a kind-hearted, benevolent woman, and although she didn't exactly care to recognize Dame Mousey-Rinks as a sister and a queen, she was willing, at this festive season, to spare her the tidbits she had a mind to. So she said, "Come out then, Dame Mousey-Rinks. Of course you shall taste my browned fat." So Dame Mousey-Rinks came rushing out as fast as she could, held up her pretty little paws, and took morsel after morsel of the brown fat as the queen held them out to her. But then all Dame Mousey-Rinks' uncles, and her cousins, and her aunts came jumping out too, and her 7 sons, who were terrible ne'er-do-wells, into the bargain, and they all set to at the brown fat, and the queen was too frightened to keep them at bay. Most fortunately, the mistress of the robes came in, and drove these I have trouble when it's like that, importunate visitors away, so that a little of the brown fat was left. And this, when the court mathematician, an ex-senior wrangler of his university, was called in, which he had to be on purpose, it was found possible by means of skillfully devised apparatus provided with special micrometer screws, and so forth, to apportion and distribute amongst the whole the sausages under construction. The kettle drums and the trumpets summoned all the great princes and potentates to the feast. They assembled in their robes of state, some of them on white palfreys, some in crystal coaches. The king received them with much gracious ceremony. He took his seat at the head of the table, with his crown on, and his scepter in his hand. Even during the serving of the white pudding course, it was observed that he turned pale and raised his eyes to heaven. Sighs heaved his bosom. Some incredible inward pain was clearly raging within him, and when the black puddings were handed round, he fell back in his seat, loudly sobbing and groaning. Everyone rose from the table, and the court physician tried in vain to feel his pulse. Ultimately, after the administration of most powerful remedies, burnt feathers, and the like, his Majesty seemed to recover his senses to some extent, and stammered scarce audibly the words, "Too little fat." The queen cast herself down at his feet in despair, and cried, in a voice broken by sobs, "Oh, my poor unfortunate royal consort! Ah, what tortures you are doomed to endure! See the culprit here at your feet! Punish her severely! Alas, Dame Mousey-Rinks, her uncles, her 7 sons, her cousins, and her aunts, came and ate up nearly all the fat, and—" Here the queen fell back insensible. But the king jumped up all anger, and cried in a terrible voice, "Mistress of the robes, what is the meaning of this?" The mistress of the robes told all she knew, and the king resolved to take revenge on Dame Mousey-Rinks and her family for eating up the fat which ought to have been in the sausages. The privy council was summoned, and it was resolved that Dame Mousey-Rinks should be tried for her life, and all her property confiscated. But as his Majesty was of opinion that she might go on consuming the fat which was his appanage, the whole matter was referred to the court clockmaker and arcanist, whose name was the same as mine, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer. and he undertook to expel Dame Mouserinks and all her relations from the palace precincts forever, by means of a certain politico-dynamic procedure. He invented certain ingenious little machines into which pieces of brown fat were inserted, and he placed all these machines down all about the dwelling of Dame Mouserinks. Now she herself was much too knowing not to see through Drosselmeyer's artifice, but all of her remonstrances and warnings to her relatives were unavailing. Enticed by the fragrant odor of the brown fat, all her 7 sons and a great many of her uncles, her cousins, and her aunts walked into little Drosselmeyer's machines and were immediately taken prisoners by the fall of a small grating, after which they met with a shameful death in the kitchen. Dame Mouserinks left this scene of horror with her small following. Rage and despair filled her breast. The court rejoiced greatly. The queen was very anxious, because she knew Dame Mouserinks' character, and knew well that she would never allow the death of her sons and other relatives to go unavenged. And in fact, one day when the queen was cooking a fricassee of sheep's lights for the king, a dish to which he was exceedingly partial, Dame Mouserinks suddenly made her appearance, and said,
"My sons and my uncles, my cousins and my aunts are now no more. Have a care, lady, lest the queen of the mice bites your little princess in two. Have a care."
with which she vanished and was no more to be seen. But the queen was so frightened that she dropped the fricassee into the fire. So this was the second time Dame Mouserinks spoiled one of the king's favorite dishes, at which he was very irate. But this is enough for tonight. We'll go on with the rest of it another time. Sorely as Marie, who had ideas of her own about this story, begged Godpapa Drosselmeyer to go on with it, he would not be persuaded, but jumped up, saying, "Too much at a time wouldn't be good for you. The rest tomorrow." Just as Drosselmeyer was going out the door, Fritz said, "I say, Godpapa Drosselmeyer, was it really you who invented mouse traps?" "How can you ask such silly questions?" cried his mother. But Drosselmeyer laughed oddly and said, "Well, you know I'm a clever clockmaker. Mouse traps had to be invented some time or other." "And now you know, dear children," said Godpapa Drosselmeyer the next evening, "why it was the queen took such precautions about her little Pirlipat. Had she not always the fear before her eyes of Dame Mouserinks coming back and carrying out her threat of biting the princess to death? Drosselmeyer's ingenious machines were of no avail against the clever, crafty Dame Mouserinks, and nobody save the court astronomer, who was also state astrologer and reader of the stars, knew that the family of the cat Purr had the power to keep her at bay. This was the reason why each of the lady nurses was obliged to keep one of the sons of that family, each of whom was given the honorary rank and title of Privy Councillor of Legation, in her lap, and render his onerous duty less irksome by gently scratching his back. One night, just after midnight, one of the chief nurses stationed close to the cradle woke suddenly from a profound sleep. Everything lay buried in slumber, not a purr to be heard. Deep, death-like silence set the death watch ticking, and the wainscot sounded quite loud. What were the feelings of this principal nurse when she saw close beside her a great hideous mouse, standing on its hind legs, with its horrid head laid on the princess's face? She sprang up with a scream of terror. Everybody awoke. But then Dame Mouserinks, for she was the big mouse in Pirlipat's cradle, ran quickly into the corner of the room. The privy councillors of legation dashed after her, but too late. She is off and away through a chink in the floor. The noise awoke Pirlipat, who cried terribly. "Heaven be thanked! She is still alive!" cried all the nurses. But what was their horror when they looked at Pirlipat and saw what the beautiful, delicate little thing had turned into! An enormous, bloated head, instead of the pretty little golden-haired one, at the top of a diminutive, crumpled-up body, and green, wooden-looking eyes staring out where the lovely azure-blue pair had been, whilst her mouth had stretched across from one ear to the other. Of course, the queen nearly died of weeping and loud lamentation, and the walls of the king's study had all to be hung with padded areas, because he kept banging his head against them, crying, "Oh, wretched king that I am! Oh, wretched king that I am!" Of course, he might have seen then that it would have been much better to eat his puddings with no fat in them at all, and let Dame Mousey-Rinks and her folk stay on under the hearthstone. But Pirlipat's royal father thought not of that. What he did was to lay all the blame on the court clockmaker and arcanist, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer of Nuremberg. Wherefore, he promulgated a sapient edict to the effect that Drosselmeyer should, within the space of 4 weeks, restore Princess Pirlipat to her pristine condition, or at least indicate an unmistakable and reliable process whereby that might be accomplished, or else suffer a shameful death by the axe of the common headsman. Drosselmeyer was not a little alarmed, but he soon began to place confidence in his art and in his luck. So he proceeded to execute the first operation which seemed to him to be expedient. He took Princess Pirlipat very carefully to pieces, screwed off her hands and her feet, and examined her interior structure. Unfortunately, he found that the bigger she got, the more deformed she would be, so that he didn't see what was to be done at all. He put her carefully together again, and sank down beside her cradle, which he wasn't allowed to go away from, in the deepest dejection. The 4th week had come, and Wednesday of the 4th week, when the king came in, with eyes gleaming with anger, made threatening gestures with his scepter, and cried, "Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, restore the princess, or prepare for death!" Drosselmeyer began to weep bitterly. The little princess kept on cracking nuts, an occupation which seemed to afford her much quiet satisfaction. For the first time, the arcanist was struck by Pirlipat's remarkable appetite for nuts, the circumstance that she had been born with teeth. And the fact had been that immediately after her transformation she had begun to cry, and had gone on crying till by chance she got hold of a nut. She at once cracked it and ate the kernel, after which she was quite quiet. From that time her nurses found that nothing would do but to go on giving her nuts. Oh, holy instinct of nature! Eternal, mysterious, inscrutable interdependence of things! Cried Drosselmeyer. Thou pointest out to me the door of the secret. I will knock, and it shall be opened unto me. He at once begged for an interview with the court astronomer, and was conducted him, closely guarded. They embraced with many tears, for they were great friends, and then retired into a private closet, where they referred to many books treating of sympathies, antipathies, and other mysterious subjects. Night came on. The court astronomer consulted the stars, and with the assistance of Drosselmeyer, himself an adept in astrology, drew the princess's horoscope. This was an exceedingly difficult operation, for the lines kept getting more and more entangled and confused for ever so long. But at last, oh, what joy! It lay plain before them that all the princess had to do to be delivered from the enchantment which made her so hideous, and get back her former beauty, was to eat the sweet kernel of the Nutcracker. Now, this nut had a shell so hard that you might have fired a 48-pounder at it without producing the slightest effect on it. Moreover, it was essential that this nut should be cracked, in the princess's presence, by the teeth of a man whose beard had never known a razor, and who had never had on boots. This man had to hand the kernel to her with his eyes closed, and he might not open them till he had made 7 steps backwards without a stumble. Drosselmeyer and the astronomer had been at work on this problem uninterruptedly for 3 days and 3 nights. And on the Saturday the king was sitting at dinner when Drosselmeyer, who was to have been beheaded on the Sunday morning, burst joyfully in to announce that he had found out what had to be done to restore Princess Pirlipat to her pristine beauty. The king embraced him in a burst of rapture, and promised him a diamond sword, 4 decorations, and 2 Sunday suits. "Set to work immediately after dinner," the monarch cried, adding kindly, "Take care, dear Arcanist, that the young unshaven gentleman in shoes, with the Nutcracker already in his hand, is on the spot, and be sure that he touches no liquor beforehand, so that he mayn't trip up when he makes his 7 backwards steps like a crab. He can get as drunk as a lord afterwards, if he likes." Drosselmeyer was dismayed at this utterance of the king's, and stammered out, not without trembling and hesitation, that, though the remedy was discovered, both the Nutcracker and the young gentleman who was to crack it had still to be searched for, and that it was a matter of doubt whether they ever would be got hold of at all. The king, greatly incensed, whirled his scepter round his crowned head, and shouted in the voice of a lion, "Very well, then, you must be beheaded." It was exceedingly fortunate for the wretched Drosselmeyer that the king had thoroughly enjoyed his dinner that day, and was consequently in an admirable temper, and disposed to listen to the sensible advice which the queen, who was very sorry for Drosselmeyer, did not spare to give him. Drosselmeyer took heart, and represented that he really had fulfilled the conditions, and discovered the necessary measures, and had gained his life consequently. The king said this was all bosh and nonsense, but at length, after 2 or 3 glasses of liquors, decreed that Drosselmeyer and the astronomer should start off immediately, and not come back without the Nutcracker in their pockets. The man who was to crack it, by the queen's suggestion, might be heard of by means of advertisements in the local and foreign newspapers and gazettes. Godpapa Drosselmeyer interrupted his story at this point, and promised to finish it the following evening. Next evening, as soon as the lights were brought, Godpapa Drosselmeyer duly arrived, and went on with his story as follows. Drosselmeyer and the court astronomer had been journeying for 15 long years without finding the slightest trace of the Nutcracker. I might go on for more than 4 weeks telling you where all they had been, and what extraordinary things they had seen. I shall not do so, however, but merely mention that Drosselmeyer, in his profound discouragement, at last began to feel a powerful longing to see his dear native town of Nuremberg once again, and he was more powerfully moved by this longing than usual one day, when he happened to be smoking a pipe of canister with his friend in the middle of a great forest in Asia, and cried, "Oh, Nuremberg, Nuremberg, dear native town! He who still knows thee not, place of renown, though far he has travelled, and great cities seen, as London and Paris and Peterwardine, knoweth not what it is happy to be. Still must his longing heart languish for thee, O Nuremberg, exquisite town, where the houses have windows, both upstairs and down." As Drosselmeyer lamented thus dolefully, the astronomer, seized with compassionate sympathy, began to weep and howl so terribly that he is heard throughout the length and breadth of Asia. But he collected himself again, wiped the tears from his eyes, and said, "After all, dearest colleague, why should we sit and weep and howl here? Why not come to Nuremberg? Doesn't matter a brass farthing, after all, where and how we search for this horrible Nutcracker." "That's true, too," answered Drosselmeyer, consoled. They both got up immediately, knocked the ashes out of their pipes, started off, and travelled straight on without stopping, from that forest right in the centre of Asia, till they came to Nuremberg. As soon as they got there, Drosselmeyer went straight to his cousin, the toy maker and doll carver, and gilder and varnisher, whom he had not seen for a great many long years. To him he told all the tale of Princess Pirlipat, Dame Mousy Rinks, and the Nutcracker. Said he clapped his hands repeatedly and cried in amazement, "Dear me, cousin, these things are really wonderful, very wonderful indeed." Drosselmeyer told him further some of the adventures he had met with on his journey, how he had spent 2 years in the court of the King of Dates, how the Prince of Almonds had expelled him with ignominy from his territory, how he had applied in vain to the Natural History Society at Squirreltown, in short, how he had been everywhere utterly unsuccessful in discovering the faintest trace of the Nutcracker. During this narrative, Christoph Zacharias had kept frequently snapping his fingers, twisting himself round on one foot, smacking his tongue, etc., then cried, "Hey-hi-oh! That really would be the very deuce and all." At last he threw his hat and wig in the air, warmly embraced his cousin, and cried, "Cousin, cousin, you're a made man! A made man you are, for either I am much deceived, or I have got the Nutcracker myself." He immediately produced a little cardboard box, out of which he took a gilded nut of medium size. "Look there," he said, showing this nut to his cousin. "The state of matters as regards this nut is this. Several years ago, at Christmas time, a stranger man came here with a sack of nuts which he offered for sale. Just in front of my shop he got into a quarrel, and put the sack down the better to defend himself from the nut sellers of the place who attacked him. Just then a heavily loaded wagon drove over the sack, and all the nuts were smashed but one. The stranger man, with an odd smile, offered to sell me this nut for a 20-kreuzer piece of the year 1796. This struck me as strange. I found just such a coin in my pocket. So I bought the nut, and I gilt it over, though I didn't know why I took the trouble quite, or should have given so much for it." All question as to its really being the long-sought Nutcracker was dispelled when the court astronomer carefully scraped away the gilding, and found the word Krakatuk graven on the shell in Chinese characters. The joy of the exiles was great, as you may imagine, and the cousin was even happier, for Drosselmeyer assured him that he was a made man too, as he was sure of a good pension and all the gold leaf he'd want for the rest of his life for his gilding, free, gratis, for nothing. The arcanist and the astronomer had both got on their nightcaps, and were going to turn into bed when the astronomer said, "I tell you what it is, dear colleague. One piece of good fortune never comes alone. I feel convinced that we've not only found the nut, but the young gentleman who is to crack it, and hand the beauty-restoring kernel to the princess into the bargain. I mean none other than your cousin's son here. I don't intend to close an eye this night, until I've drawn the youngster's horoscope." With which he threw away his nightcap, and at once set to work to consult the stars. The cousin's son was a nice-looking, well-grown young fellow who had never been shaved and had never worn boots. True, he had been a jumping jack for a Christmas or two in his earlier days, but there was scarcely any trace of this discoverable about him. His appearance had been so altered by his father's care. He had appeared last Christmas in a beautiful red coat with gold trimmings, a sword by his side, his hat under his arm, and a fine wig with a pigtail. Thus apparelled, he stood in his father's shop exceeding lovely to behold, and from his native galanterie he occupied himself in cracking nuts for the young ladies, who called him the handsome Nutcracker. Next morning the astronomer fell with much emotion into the arcanist's arms, crying, "This is the very man! We have got him! He is found! Only, dearest colleague, 2 things we must keep carefully in view. In the first place, we must construct a most substantial pigtail for this precious nephew of yours. which shall be connected with his lower jaw in such sort that it shall be capable of communicating a very powerful pull to it. And next, when we get back to the residence, we must carefully conceal the fact that we have brought the young gentleman who is to shiver the knot back with us. He must not make his appearance for a considerable time after us. I read in the horoscope that if 2 or 3 others bite the knot unsuccessfully to begin with, the king will promise the man who breaks it, and as a consequence restores the princess her good looks, the princess's hand, and the succession to the crown. The doll-maker cousin was immensely delighted with the idea of his son's marrying Princess Pirlipat, and being a prince and king, so he gave him wholly over to the envoys to do what they liked with him. The pigtail which Drosselmeyer attached to him proved to be a very powerful and efficient instrument, as he exemplified by cracking the hardest of peach stones with the utmost ease. Drosselmeyer and the astronomer, having at once sent the news to the residents of the discovery of the Nutcracker, the necessary advertisements were at once put in the newspapers. By the time that our travelers got there, several nice young gentlemen, among whom were princes even, had arrived, having sufficient confidence in their teeth to try to disenchant the princess. The ambassadors were horrified when they saw poor Pirlipat again. The diminutive body, with tiny hands and feet, was not big enough to support the great shapeless head. The hideousness of the face was enhanced by a beard like white cotton, which had grown about the mouth and chin. Everything had turned out as the court astronomer had read it in the horoscope. One milksop in shoes after another bit his teeth, and his jaws in agonies over the nut, without doing the princess the slightest good in the world. And then, when he was carried out on the verge of insensibility by the dentists who were in attendance on purpose, he would sigh, "Ah, dear, that was a hard nut." Now when the king, in the anguish of his soul, had promised him who should disenchant the princess, his daughter, and the kingdom, the charming, gentle young Drosselmeyer made his appearance, and begged to be allowed to make an attempt. None of the previous ones had pleased the princess so much. She pressed her little hands to her heart and sighed, "Ah, I hope it will be he who will crack the nut, and be my husband." When he had politely saluted to the king, the queen, and the Princess Pirlipat, he received the Nutcracker from the hands of the clerk of the closet, put it between his teeth, made a strong effort with his head, and crack, crack, the shell was shattered into a number of pieces. He neatly cleared the kernel from the pieces of husk which were sticking to it, and, making a leg, presented it courteously to the princess, after which he closed his eyes and began his backward steps. The princess swallowed the kernel, and, oh marvel, the monstrosity vanished, and in its place there stood a wonderfully beautiful lady, with a face which seemed woven of delicate lily white and rose-red silk, eyes of sparkling azure, and hair all in little curls like threads of gold. Trumpets and kettle-drums mingled in the loud rejoicings of the populace. The king and all his court danced about on one leg, as they had done at Pirlipat's birth, and the queen had to be treated with eau de cologne, having fallen into a fainting fit from joy and delight. All of this tremendous tumult interfered not a little with young Drosselmeyer's self-possession, for he still had to make his 7 backward steps. But he collected himself as best he could, and was just stretching out his right foot to make his 7th step, when up came Dame Mousey-Rinks through the floor, making horrible weaking and squeaking, so that Drosselmeyer, as he was putting his foot down, trod upon her, and stumbled so that he almost fell. Oh, misery! In an instant he is transmogrified, just as the princess had been before. His body, all shriveled up, and could scarcely support the great shapeless head with enormous projecting eyes and the wide gaping mouth. In the place where his pigtail used to be, a scanty wooden cloak hung down, controlling the movements of his nether jaw. The clockmaker and the astronomer were wild with terror and consternation, but they saw that Dame Mousy Rings was wallowing in her gore on the floor. Her wickedness had not escaped punishment, for young Drosselmeyer had squashed her so in the throat with the sharp point of his shoe that she was mortally hurt. But as Dame Mousy Rings lay in her death agony, she queeked and cheeped in a lamentable style, and cried, "Oh, Crackatuke, thou not so hard! O fate which none may disregard! Hee, pee, pee, woe's me, I cry, since I through that hard nut must die. But, brave young Nutcracker, I see, you soon must follow after me. My sweet young son, with sevenfold crown, will soon bring Master Cracker down. His mother's death he will repay, so Nutcracker, beware that day. O life most sweet, I feebly cry, I leave you now, for I must die. Squeak! With this cry died Dame Mousy Rings, and her body was carried out by the court stove lighter. Meantime, nobody had been troubling themselves about young Drosselmeyer, but the princess reminded the king of his promise. He at once directed that the young hero should be conducted to his presence. When the poor wretch came forward in his transmogrified condition, the princess put both her hands to her face and cried, "Oh, please take away that horrid Nutcracker!" So the Lord Chamberlain seized him immediately by his little shoulders and shied him out at the door. The king, furious at the idea of a Nutcracker being brought before him as a son-in-law, laid all the blame upon the clockmaker and the astronomer, and ordered them both to be banished forever. The horoscope which the astronomer had drawn in Nuremberg had said nothing about this. That didn't hinder him from making some fresh observations. And the stars told him that young Drosselmeyer would conduct himself so admirably in his new condition that he would yet be a prince and a king in spite of his transmogrification, but also that his deformity would only disappear after the son of Dame Mousy Rings, the seven-headed king of the mice, whom she had borne after the death of her original 7 sons, should perish by his hand, and a lady should fall in love with him notwithstanding his deformity. That is the story of the hard nut, children. And now you know why people so often use the expression, "that was a hard nut," and why nutcrackers are so ugly. Thus did Godpapa Drosselmeyer finish his tale. Marie thought the Princess Prillabat was a nasty, ungrateful thing. Fritz, on the other hand, was of opinion that if Nutcracker had been a proper sort of fellow, he would have settled the Mouse King's hash and got his good looks back again. That's where we're going to leave off for today. Hope you're still enjoying, and I'll see you next time.